This is Phil Race and Sally Brown visiting Central Queensland University, and Phil and I have been working together, writing together, talking together for more than 20 years, been married for 16 of those. And what we do is we find that we tremendously enjoy working together, writing together, and just sometimes we find there are some areas that we completely disagree about. Phil, one of those areas that you and I sometimes have quite lengthy discussions about, apart from the nature of objective truth and that kind of thing, is how important those kinds of models like Bloom and Kolb are when people are trying to think about teaching in universities. So why is it that you think Kolb is such a useless model that we can use in higher education?
I think in every area of human endeavour we get new models, new theories, replacing old models and old theories. And sometimes the old theories were quite wrong, in fact. In science, for example, way back, there was the phlogiston theory that explained 9/10 of what was known to science in those days. Then Lavoisier came along in France and proved that there was no such thing as phlogiston. The theory was completely wrong, as it were. So it is not unknown for theories to be completely wrong.
Yes, but Kolb isn't quite in that kind of field.
No, I'm not saying it is, but I think it misses an awful lot of things that are important to be there. Kolb, I think the factors that make up the cycle were interesting but incomplete. And
so Kolb's cycle of experiential learning been written about since the 50s?
76 or so that really started.
Yeah.
The recent review by Caulfield et al. Brought together a lot of researchers who argue against the validity of that particular approach. But from my point of view, what's missing there's about 7 things missing in that particular cycle. There's no people there. It's a very abstract, dry sort of thing. Learning and teaching and research are all about people doing things. There's no feelings there. There's no humanity in there. It's all just abstract, as it were. There's no reasoning in there. There's no making judgments in there. There's no applying criteria in there. It's just static, as it were. There's no emotion in there. There's no way of touching the human soul and inspiring. There's no rationale in there, in the sense that there's no want to learn, there's no desire to learn, there's no need to learn. It's just assumed it's all going to happen. And I think to really make people learn, we have to look at the human side of learning. Learning is done by human beings.
Yeah, but there's almost no programmes on learning and teaching in higher education that don't refer to Kolb at some point. And I think although there are flaws in Kolb, it is really helpful to look at those 4 stages in his cycle and say, where are we doing these things in what we're doing? I agree with you that it isn't necessarily a cycle. You don't necessarily have to do them in the strict order that Kolb suggests. But you must admit those 4 areas are actually quite helpful things for people to be doing when they're learning.
I wouldn't go as far as to admit that.
Would you not?
Caulfield et al. Focused on the research of Viestra and de Jong, that there aren't 4 things there. There's only 2. Doing versus reflection. They boiled it down to a bipolar resonance between action and reflection. Now, that's fine, they are 2 of the important parts. But concrete experience and active experimentation boil down to the same thing, in fact. So it's at best a 3-legged cycle, probably a 2-legged cycle.
But one of the things I've heard you fulminate about before now is the fact that you think it's tremendously jargonistic, and you and I have disagreed many times about jargon, because my belief is that jargon is only the specialist language that somebody else doesn't understand, and that actually we far too often condemn terms as jargon when they're actually quite useful terms. I think active experimentation is quite a useful term.
Jargon distances people from subjects. I think jargon is used by people who want to show how clever they are and impress other people who haven't yet got the jargon.
Or is it just simply an accurate description that a lot of people can agree on? Because when somebody has coined a term like active experimentation and then described what they mean by it, that becomes then part of a common currency that people can share and talk about.
Well, let's take another example. intrinsic motivation. That is exactly the same as wanting to learn. And extrinsic motivation is exactly the same as needing to learn, being required to learn for other people.
Well, there might be just a little bit more in there than that.
I really think not. I think there's actually a lot more in wanting and in needing than there is in extrinsic and extrinsic. Now, I've marked thousands of PG Cert assignments where people get mixed up between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. There's no mix-up between a want and a need. These are words that everybody shares the meaning of. And why use words? I mean, the 100,000 people I've asked questions about their learning, not one of them yet has replied, I was intrinsically motivated, thank you, Phil, that's why I did it. That's not the sort of language real people use.
But we're talking about university students here and university teachers.
So are we saying that the language in university has to be different from the normal language of communication?
But it's all right to use technical language without labelling it jargon.
Technical language is needed where technology is there. But, I was a scientist before I became an educationalist. And, words like trichloroacetaldehyde are long, complex words. But chemists don't use the word trichloroacetaldehyde at all. That is the name for something that they show by a symbol, that we know what it is by a much shorter symbol. And I think if coming into higher education is about learning all the long names for things rather than getting a grip on how they work and why they're there and what we can do with them, education has missed the boat.
Well, yes and no. In that sometimes we can say a word like epistemological, and that's really helpful in describing a thing that we're trying to do in our learning, which is to go back to the basis of knowledge. And I think it's sometimes very helpful to have those labels in curriculum design that help us to reassure ourselves that what the student's doing is genuinely demanding.
But is that not a case of a small subset of people who know that sort of language as their technology, are expecting engineers and drama teachers and nurses to learn that language to do their practice, when there is a much simpler language that will lend itself to communicate to all of these people?
So what about the language of learning outcomes then, Phil?
Learning outcomes are absolutely vitally important. We need students to know exactly what it is they're supposed to become able to do. We need them to know what the evidence of achievement is that we're looking for, what the standards of the evidence of achievement are. But the word that gets all sorts of trouble with learning outcomes is understanding. Because understanding isn't an outcome. Understanding is a journey, not a destination. If you understand something today and write down your understanding of it and put it away for a year, bring it out a year later, you'll think, I didn't understand that then, I understand it now. If you do it a year later, it's the same. So the point of measuring learning is not about measuring points on that journey, it's measuring what people can show at those particular stages.
Well, I am with you there on the term understanding. I always think of how do I know whether I understand whether a car engine works? Now, my mum understood how a lorry engine worked because she'd been in the army in the war and she'd dismantled a car engine and she'd been taught how a car engine works in theoretical classes where they used extremely vulgar terms to explain some of the things that were happening within the carburettor, etc. And then she was able to apply it in practice. Her understanding of a car engine working is very different from mine, and that's to do with, I think, a lot of the application of the kinds of things you often talk about, which is learning by doing. So I would agree with you that learning outcomes have to be simple enough for the students to be able to understand, and if they are simple enough for the students to be able to understand, they probably work for the academic staff and the quality assurers as well.
I think we want the students to, quote, understand these, but what we really want the students to do is to know what the evidence of achievement we're looking for is. And there's a lot of fuss about learning outcomes that really should be focused on the evidence of achievement. If you show students, this is what I want you to be able to do, here are some people that did the program last year and this is what they've done, etc. Once students get a grip on what the target is, what they're doing is going to result in, we don't need long words to describe it. They can see it, they can feel it, and they can judge it.
And there, I think, we are in agreement.
Indeed.